So Michael is going to talk to us from the Transient and Variable Stars collaboration.
Okay, hopefully you see my screen okay.
Yes.
So I'll be presenting on behalf of the Transients and Variable Stars Science Collaboration. I want to note that TVS co-chairs Fed and Rachel also contributed to this talk. So TVS is one of the largest science collaborations with over 200 members spread over 5 continents. TVS represents the greatest diversity of scientific topics of all the science collaborations with 14 total subgroups dedicated to the study of time domain phenomenon, both galactic and extragalactic. So a lot of the things of interest to us have already been covered in previous talks. Due to the great diversity of interest, the science collaboration is interested in objects spanning a vast range of timescales and energy scales. Our collaboration has a lot of interests in time critical science, which will synergize very well with LSST and the broker system and the alerts. These are often the types of sources that many people think of with respect to broker science. LSST will provide statistically significant populations of these events and objects to study. Non-time critical science cases may initially be overlooked though in terms of brokers, but we need to be mindful that these science cases are also supported by the brokers. The brokers may also become the entry point for new scientists who want to work with LSST data and science. So broad input from many viewpoints is very useful for our science group in terms of brokers. So a couple of years ago, the TVS formed a broker task force. So most of my talk is going to be summarizing some of the results that came out of that. So there's this link here. Copy this down, look at it, or also this will be sent out as a PDF later on for anyone who wants to look at it. But this is probably the best way to get look at the results because I can't summarize all of it. There's a lot of information. But the goal of the broker task force was to really force our members to think through what was needed from the brokers and how they planned on interacting with them. So the survey began with the question of the scientific interests of the science collaboration. You can see it's a very broad range of science interests, including solar system science. And this is useful to keep in mind for understanding some of the later questions. So the survey asked how important classification is from brokers, and almost 84% of responses felt that classification was an important function for brokers to perform. We had 0 responses suggesting that classification was completely unnecessary. I'd like to add that classification is useful not just saying that, yes, this is exactly the type of object I'm looking for, because oftentimes that's just impossible or at least very difficult. It's also important to have classifiers that can rule out certain imposter type objects, such as background AGN or asteroids. These can help narrow down the scope of follow-up observations and lead to more fruitful research projects. The broker task force requested information on simple classification criteria that would be useful for the brokers to provide. There's an extensive list, and I highly, highly recommend the brokers look through this. There were 32 responses covering various research interests. And I just paraphrase some of the more basic ones, or kind of a range of some of the easier ones and some of the more difficult ones. You know, RA, dec, brightness, color, kind of more basic things I think a lot of the brokers have already done. However, we have a strong interest in understanding or pursuing unclassifiable objects. And also things like host galaxy associations and redshift measurements are of very strong interest to the extragalactic transit community because those can also be necessary for triggering observations on other observatories, such as in the radio or the X-rays. One question asked how the members of the collaboration would like to be notified of the alerts that satisfy their requirements from the previous questions. See, web page and API seem to be The top two with VO event stream and email seem to be kind of a second tier of priority. The collaboration was asked, will the information in LSST alerts be sufficient for your science? And 3/4 of the people who responded indicated that brokers could be extremely valuable by adding new data products to the alerts. The survey asked what additional information was needed. The light curve history is far and away the most critical for the science goals. These are just what was people could select on their own, but there are quite a few manually submitted responses, which I'll show on this next slide. And a lot of these, you can see that these are really fitting in with the previous question of what metrics people wanted to use. So this makes a lot of sense. However, I did add at the very bottom information on satellite constellations. This was not included in the broker survey. However, has become something that within TVS we are worried about with how the satellite constellations could affect our data. So this is something might be useful for the brokers to keep in mind and see how they can take that into account. Then ask what catalogs are most useful for cross-matching purposes. The top ones are pretty obvious and make sense. These are, again, just the ones that were people were allowed to choose, and there were quite a few other catalogs that people requested that they thought would be useful. And you can see that this list really reflects the diversity and the science collaboration. We have variable star catalogs, quasar catalogs, nearby galaxy, distance to galaxies, and also a strong interest in multi-wavelength catalogs, radio catalogs, X-ray, and TeV. It's also important for our science collaboration to cross-match alerts produced by different observatories. For instance, the gravitational wave community would really benefit from cross-matches there, ZTF cross-matches. So this is just to help gauge people's interest, and some people who responded had additional surveys that they thought would be useful to cross-match against, which are listed here. And more than one user advocated for cross-matching against all possible alert sources. And pointed out the value of alerts coming from different surveys with different observing cadences and covering different energy bands or even just different optical filters. So here they were asked, well, what timescales do individuals need access to the alerts? Again, this reflects the diverse range of science topics and different timescales for those objects that people study. The majority needed information within a few days for their science cases, and nearly half would really prefer to have alerts within hours if possible. There seemed to be a very large span in how often people thought they might query a broker service. There's just kind of this little sliver of individuals who might want some sort of API to just query brokers continuously. Thank you. But the rest of it seems pretty much quartered pretty evenly in the distribution. The majority of users would prefer to have both a nice online portal to interact with the brokers as well as some sort of a software API. So those are, I think, very useful for brokers to take into account. The survey asked what is the essential functionality that the broker should provide. Searching on science metrics is the favorite, followed closely by the ability to display a summary of information related to the alert. I would assume that this summary of information would also include cross-matching and other value-added data products that the broker would calculate or provide. Okay, and I will skip these last two slides. I'll include these with the PDF though, but they're basically restating a lot of the previous information that you've already seen. So they're not too surprising. So I'd highly suggest people who are interested in the TVS needs, go to that document to read the full information there. But I also highly suggest keeping a lookout for the TVS Science Roadmap, where a lot of the science goals have been more matured in the past 2 years. And it may give developers further ideas of services, analytics, and metrics that could be beneficial to our science collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Do we have questions?
No, not yet, anyhow.
So I posted a question. You mentioned satellites.
Yeah, sorry. What satellite orbits would be stationary in RA deck during 30 seconds? Michael asks.
What satellites would be stationary for 30 seconds? Oh, you're talking about the satellite constellations?
Yep, I believe that's what it is addressing.
Yeah, I'm assuming that also the scheduling of LSST could help kind of filter some of those out by looking for things that have to show up in multiple exposures or things like that.
No, my point is, aren't they all moving?
Yeah, they're all moving, so you'd be able to maybe filter those out.
Good. Do we have more questions?
Julian is writing something. Yeah, Julian says, could we reuse the survey at some point? Julian, do you want to clarify the comment?
Oh, yes, yes. So if I understand correctly, this survey has been sent last year or a year and a half ago. It would be interesting if we can send this survey to all participants, for example, of this workshop and get some updated answer. Because if I understand, there was 30-ish response to this survey. If we can get 100 or 200, that would be
yeah, it could be useful, especially since there were quite a few extra added things. So then it's hard to judge how many people would be interested in some of those extra things that were added manually, but weren't necessarily populated in the same manner.
Okay, so let me know if we can post it on the website of this workshop at some point.
So if I may, I think we should think carefully about when we want to send this survey out again, because there is survey burnout and we can't send it out 5 more times. I think we got like 1 shot, maybe 2 before the beginning of Rubin. So we want to, in conjunction with this workshop is a great idea, but perhaps we want to advertise it a bit more broadly, and we should think about that carefully.
Sure.
Okay, great. So with that, we finished this session. Thanks a lot, Michael, and thanks everyone for participating. So